The 1980s, when American culture was at an all-time high and Hollywood blockbusters, MTV, and rock and wrestling ruled the world. In that era, a hyper-masculine style emerged, one of macho men with mullets, muscles, and machine guns, hot explosions, hotter babes, and radical guitar solos. This is 80s cool. When you think about the term 80s cool, I'm sure many images pop into your head. Maybe it's something that just played in the intro. To some extent, we all have a vague notion of the 1980s version of cool. The aim of this video is to remove any of that ambiguity and to get down to the core of what it meant to be cool in the 1980s. So with that in mind, where should I start? When I think about the 1980s, the first thing that comes to mind is the action hero. You know, the shirtless, muscle-bound guy holding a machine gun, or the maverick cop who doesn't play by the rules. This trend was an inescapable part of the decade. In the cinema, you had your beefcake heroes like Sly and Arnold, the face of wrestling was Hulk Hogan, and TV had the A-Team for adults and G.I. Joe for kids. The action hero was an integral part of what made the 80s cool, so let's begin this discussion by defining the 80s action hero. 80s style action movies dominated pop culture from about 1982 to 1993. These films usually featured a muscular man armed with enough weapons to take on a small country, killing bad guys who attended the Stormtrooper School of Marksmanship. We all know that this era happened, but when exactly did it become such a vital chapter in pop culture history? The origin of this genre could warrant an entire video, but in short, the core features of the action hero we associate with the 80s began to emerge in the 1970s. You had rogue cop action movies like Dirty Harry, the depiction of vigilante justice in Death Wish, the bombastic, big-budget action of the James Bond series, and martial arts movies that became popular largely thanks to Bruce Lee. Although many elements of the action hero burned brightly through the 70s, it's difficult to say exactly when he emerged from the ashes. In my opinion, one of the earliest examples of the transition to the ideal 80s action hero is 1979's Mad Max. Mad Max had many elements that felt fresh compared to what came before. The hero was young and athletic. Max's leather and aviators combo became a signature look in the 80s. The bad guys were from a punk biker gang. It had badass muscle cars, car crashes, and explosions. These features, along with its wild success, made Mad Max a strong indicator of things to come. Another 70s trend that had a major impact on the action genre was the growing popularity of bodybuilding. Bodybuilding became extremely popular in the late 70s, mostly due to the 1977 documentary Pumping Iron. Because of the popularity of bodybuilding and pro wrestling, audiences started to want action heroes that looked like action figures. The beginning of the 1980s was explosively innovative as action evolved at a staggering pace due to movies like Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Road Warrior. But the most important year of all was 1982. So many critical things happened in 1982 that would define 80s cinema. Blade Runner and Tron established that neon look that we often associate with the decade. Conan the Barbarian set the standard for the muscular action hero. And most importantly, First Blood gave us John Rambo, the prototype for the action hero. The action hero movie was a crucial piece in defining 80s cool. Being cool in the 80s was all about being as macho as possible, and these movies were the main vehicle that drove that image. After watching a ton of movies in preparation for this video, I created a list of what are perhaps the 10 most vital tropes of the 80s action hero movie. And they are: number 1, the action hero. As you'd expect, an action hero movie needs an action hero. A person who's a hyper-competent, one-man army capable of taking down many enemies single-handed. Number 2, bigger is better. Massive guns, huge explosions, insane stunts. The The 80s was all about pushing everything to the limit. Number 3, a police story. The protagonist of these movies was often a police officer, and they got extra points if they were a loose cannon cop who didn't play by the rules. But there were also buddy cops, funny cops, RoboCops, samurai cops. Whatever kind of cop story you can think of probably happened in the 80s. Number 4, special forces. If the hero wasn't a cop, they were likely a military or ex-military member. Number 5, crazy car stunts. Who doesn't like seeing cars explode in spectacular ways? Number 6, cannon fodder. A big group of nobody bad guys who exist solely to be murdered by our hero. Number 7, the mano-a-mano showdown. In the group of bad guys, there's usually one competent heavy who the action hero has to fight one-on-one. Number 8, the head honcho. Lastly, our group of villains often take orders from a slimy greaseball at the top. Number 9, one-liners. Our heroes weren't just expert killers, they were also the captain of their high school improv team. Number 10, a badass name. If you wanted a career as an action star, you were required to have a badass name. Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jean-Claude Van Damme. And let me demonstrate why. In a world ruled by violence, there's only one man who could clean up the mean city streets, and his name is Timothy Chalamet. See what I mean? No badass name, no dice. The 80s action era ended its reign at the top of Hollywood around 1993 with The Last Action Hero, but damn did it ever have a good run. Now that we've established how important the action hero was for 80s cool, let's dive into what you needed to have the 80s cool aesthetic. The 80s was a very stylistically diverse era, but its version of cool is fairly evident if you look for it. The best words to describe the 80s cool aesthetic are hyper-masculinity. In short, if you wanted to be that guy in the 80s, pal, you had to look bad. So let's break down how guys did that. The 80s cool aesthetic takes huge inspiration from the classic cool era. Classic cool refers to that traditional, immortal cool that came from the 1950s and was worn by actors like Marlon Brando and James Dean. A tight white t-shirt, a leather jacket, and blue jeans. A look that will never go out of style. But just like everything else about the 80s, its cool had to be larger than life. 80s cool is like classic cool after blasting some steroids and snorting an 8-ball of cocaine. It could be big, bright, and colorful, or it could be dark and gritty. As long as you looked bad to the bone, you were set. So let's get into the core elements of the 80s cool look. Number 1, blue jeans. The most American thing you could possibly wear. Number 2, the muscle shirt. A tight tank top, t-shirt, or sometimes no shirt at all with the purpose of showing off your... Number 3, ripped muscles. You didn't have to be the biggest guy to impress people in the 80s, but you had to be in shape. Number 4, a badass jacket. The badass jacket you would want in your wardrobe could include a leather biker jacket, a jean jacket, or a varsity top. Number 5, classic white sneakers or cowboy boots to round out the look. Number 6, a big poofy haircut. A hairdo that makes you stand out from the crowd. The mullet being the most iconic. Number 7, a motorcycle. And to be extra badass, having a hot babe riding on the back. Number 8, the muscle car. Motorcycles were king in the 80s, but having an American muscle car was a good second choice. Number 9, if you're an action hero, you need a signature weapon. Number 10, badass accessories. The most iconic accessory of the 80s were definitely the aviator sunglasses. Some others include a thick chain, a headband, fingerless gloves, or a lit cigar. When you combine all of these elements, you had the 80s cool look. Some excellent examples of this look include Maverick from Top Gun, Born in the USA era Bruce Springsteen, and the entire cast of Michael Jackson's Bad music video. But sometimes an aesthetic is best captured from an outside perspective. Early 90s beat-em-ups from Japan like Streets of Rage or Final Fight are the purest, highest grade form of the 80s cool aesthetic in existence. These games captured not only the style, but also the sound of 80s cool. The thing is, in most 80s movies, the music genre didn't really matter. Anything from heavy metal to a sappy love ballad could easily rock out on the same soundtrack. But I think there's one quintessential sound that defines 80s cool. And that sound was the mix of synth and hard rock in songs like Danger Zone from Top Gun, Push It to the Limit from Scarface, or the entire Rocky IV soundtrack. Hell, the Rocky IV soundtrack may as well be the 80s cool soundtrack. So now that I've established the importance of the action hero and the 80s cool aesthetic, from here on out, I'm going to provide the 25 best examples of 80s cool in movie history. Just to avoid confusion, I'm going to limit my choices to the 1980s. But make no mistake, 80s cool was very much alive in the early to mid-90s. Another important thing to mention is that I won't cover teen movies in this video. The 1980s had the most pronounced teen culture of any decade, and I feel that it should be put into its own category. So if you're wondering why your favorite movie that features teenagers time traveling or killing vampires didn't make the cut, don't worry, that video is coming. The movies in this list need to have elements of 80s action and the 80s cool aesthetic, which sadly doesn't include the Indiana Jones series. Now before I get into my list, here are some honorable mentions.
So what you gonna do, brother, when you feel the need for speed but you ain't got time to bleed? This is the best of 80s cool.
Number 25, License to Kill, 1989. Timothy Dalton, the guy who could have been the greatest Bond ever if he had better material to work with. License to Kill was the only Bond film that truly tapped into the 80s action trend, but after the Old Man Moore years, it was too little, too late. But its commercial failure didn't make it a bad movie. A Rogue Agent 007 movie may seem a little cliche now, but this was the first one to do it. And it had a lot going for it. Sanchez is a memorable villain, the Bond girls are hot as hell, and it has some amazing stunts, especially in the final act. Unfortunately, it's dragged down by a slow-paced middle act that feels a little bit made for TV. Still, it's definitely worth watching to see some gorgeous, exotic 80s locations. Much like it's worth seeing the bubble-era Japan in Number 24, Black Rain, 1989. At first, Black Rain seems like a generic 80s cop movie that mixes the loose cannon and fish-out-of-water tropes. But Black Rain's atmosphere is anything but generic. The movie is like a window into a fascinating time and place, Japan at its economic peak. There are so many beautiful shots of 1980s Japan which had such a cool visual aesthetic that I could live in forever. And even though it's a predictable police story, its execution is solid. Michael Douglas and Ken Takakura make a good buddy cop duo, and the American versus Japanese culture angle provides a fresh take on the formula. The movie is an awesome trip to 1980s Japan, but if you want to see 1980s Hong Kong, I would recommend Number 23, Bloodsport, 1988. Bloodsport has to be on the Mount Rushmore of movies that inspired fighting games. It's your prototypical fighting game premise with a bunch of fighters from around the world taking part in a deadly martial arts tournament. Bloodsport really captures a time when martial arts had a certain mystique before it was exposed by MMA. Going back to my love for Dragon Ball, there's just something I love about martial arts tournament stories. From the moment you meet all the characters, you know exactly who the finalists will be, but it doesn't matter. You're just there for those badass fight scenes supported by kick-ass 80s music. Bloodsport may have had some of the biggest beefcakes of the 80s, but nobody compares to Arnold in Number 22, Commando, 1985. When his daughter is captured by a group of scumbag terrorists, Special Forces agent John John Matrix will stop at nothing to get her back. Commando is everything awesome about 80s action captured in a 90-minute package. You have Arnold near his muscular peak. Classic one-liners. A group of hilariously evil bad guys who are so fun to watch get brutally murdered. It asks important philosophical questions like, which is more deadly, the machine gun in Arnold's hands or in his biceps? Commando is definitely meant to be a funny movie, but it's so insanely over-the-top 80s that it's more like a comedy now. It's like an unintentional parody of 80s action, but for something a little more self-aware, I would go for number 21, Return of the Living Dead, 1985. There's just something about the combination of rock and roll and killing zombies that just works. Return of the Living Dead was way ahead of its time, doing the meta horror thing a decade before it was popularized by Scream. We have a bunch of characters who are totally aware of all the zombie movie tropes and even self-aware zombies. The characters are one-note but entertaining with a good mix of personalities and make for some good drama. I love the group of young characters who are like an amalgamation of every single 80s trend put together. And man, the film's practical effects are insanely awesome, with the Tarman being one of the best zombies I've ever seen. And the great 80s monster movies just kept coming with number 20, They Live, 1988. Can you imagine what you would see if you had the They Live sunglasses in 2024? They Live has the greatest one-liner of all time. I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubblegum. If there was a movie quote Hall of Fame, that would be a first ballot entrant. They Live is just pure 80s fun with its great action and its social commentary that's about as subtle as a powerbomb through 3 flaming tables. It's a mystery to me how Rowdy Roddy Piper didn't become a bigger action movie star after this. He had the look, great screen presence, and had the physical talent to make that long fight scene so memorable and fun. They Live taught us that we shouldn't always trust the BS that we're being fed. And if you need any more reasons not to trust people, I would suggest number 19, The Hitcher, 1986. The Hitcher is probably a huge part of what killed hitchhiking, which is probably for the best. You know, Ponyboy, maybe you shouldn't pick up hitchhikers who look like a psychopathic replicant. The Hitcher is suspenseful from the first scene and never lets up. It's an awesome cat and mouse game that feels really inspired by the Terminator. One thing that shocked me was the stunts. It has one of the best car roll stunts I've ever seen. Rutger Hauer was an absolute menace of a villain and gives a chilling performance. The Hitcher represents some of the best of gritty 80s thrillers, but if you want something more campy, I would go to number 18, Rocky IV, 1985. In Rocky IV, 2 worlds collide, rival nations venting years of frustration. Rocky IV was the point when the series went entirely larger than life. The training montages, Rocky shrugging off 300 haymakers to the face, Rocky and Drago solving the Cold War with their fist, and Holly's robot. But under all of that excess, it never lost its heart. Even with his newfound fame and fortune, Stallone knew how to tell a simple and effective story that hit you in a primal place. The core of Rocky IV is Rocky's legendary friendship with Apollo, which makes the rest of the story work. And I love the little touches like Rocky training in the mountains while Drago has all that modern tech. Stallone was on fire during that time, ruling Hollywood with stars like Eddie Murphy in number 17, Beverly Hills Cop, 1984. Beverly Hills Cop is a prime example of a superstar carrying a movie on his back. In his prime, Eddie Murphy was one of the funniest and most charismatic people who ever existed, and his star power made this fairly generic cop movie into a classic. Axel Foley is such an entertaining character. He's a streetwise, silver-tongued Detroit cop who could talk his way out of anything, and you really believe that Eddie Murphy could probably do that. It's also one of the premier buddy cop movies of the era, with Foley butting heads with the comically uptight LA cops. I also can't be the only person who watched this for the first time and thought, why the hell do I keep hearing the Crazy Frog theme? The movie is pure 80s magic, which could also be said for number 16, Big Trouble in Little China, 1986. Big Trouble in Little China was like a covert parody of the 80s action hero while the genre was at its peak. Kurt Russell plays Jack, the prototypical 80s hero with his square jaw, mullet, and tank top. Most audiences at the time probably didn't expect Jack to be a bumbling, comic relief sidekick. Maybe 80s audiences weren't brought into this world to get it, but it was a bold and hilarious choice by John Carpenter. But Jack is useful to audiences as an eyes-in character to the film's fun and creative world based on Chinese mythology. It's definitely another movie that was a massive inspiration for fighting games. And it helps that the practical effects, set designs, and costumes have aged really well, which can also be said for another 1986 classic. Number 15, Highlander, 1986. Highlander is a movie that accomplishes so much in its 2-hour runtime. The story bounces back and forth between medieval Scotland and the gritty streets of New York, and both sides hold up so well. The scenes in Scotland look really good compared to other fantasy movies of that time. There's something so badass about sword fights in an urban, grungy environment, and that's basically something that Highlander invented. Something that no doubt was a huge influence on 90s cool. And I have to mention its awesome villain, the Kurgan. Sometimes you need a villain who's an irredeemable bastard just chewing up the scenery. And who can forget that killer soundtrack from Queen? And 1986 wasn't done delivering the classics just yet, as it also gave us number 14, Top Gun, 1986. Top Gun is arguably the most American movie ever made. On a big screen with surround sound, its bombastic, aerial combat footage can still blow you out of your seat. Top Gun had a major cultural impact, causing Navy and Air Force recruitment to skyrocket. And that's because it really makes you daydream about what it would be like to be a badass fighter pilot. It's no secret that Top Gun is cheesy as hell, but I wouldn't want it any other way. It's a crowd pleaser with something for everyone. An incredible soundtrack, top-notch action, romance, a great rivalry between Maverick and Iceman. Top Gun is definitely top cheese, but now it's time to talk about a movie that really puts you in the danger zone. Number 13, Escape from New York, 1981. Tell me if you've heard this premise before. A lone badass is sent to a lockdown hellhole to complete a suicide mission. Well, it all started here. In Escape from New York, the entirety of Manhattan has been made into a prison. It's a far-fetched idea, but who cares? The visuals of a dystopian New York City with the dilapidated streets filled with graffiti and garbage are truly unforgettable. It's a hellhole that you would never want to spend a second in. But seeing the ultimate badass Snake Plissken navigate the seedy world to find the president is entertaining as hell. Kurt Russell just oozes cool in the role and became the measuring stick for cinematic badassery. Everything from his outfit to that eye patch to his cold demeanor just made him an instant icon. And speaking of icons, number 12, Evil Dead 2, 1987. Evil Dead 2 is a horror comedy that was a major triumph in both areas. The film is somewhat of a remake of its predecessor and carries a lot of that film's genuine horror aspects over. But it's clear from the outset that this movie was a more tongue-in-cheek affair, with hilarious slapstick blended seamlessly with the horror. And the fact that Bruce Campbell was born to be the greatest B-movie actor of all time was a revelation. He had the dramatic and comedic ability, along with just the right amount of scenery chewing to make any scene work. I mean, who else would put a chainsaw on their arm and turn it into a... Number 11, Lethal Weapon, 1987. Lethal Weapon is the peak of the buddy cop movie, which usually features two completely different cops who play off each other in crazy situations. In this case, you have a good cop who's just about to retire, paired with a loose cannon with suicidal tendencies. The real heart of the movie is in watching the friendship between Riggs and Murtaugh develop. Glover and Gibson had an all-time level of chemistry and played off each other perfectly in the comedic and sentimental moments. And what makes so much of the movie work is the excellent dialogue written by Shane Black. Lethal Weapon is just a top-notch police story in every way. And speaking of which, number 10, Police Story, 1985. The first time I saw Police Story, I expected awesome martial arts action and death-defying stunts, and it more than delivered. It has some of the most painful-looking stunts I've ever seen, with one so legendary that they repeated it 3 times. But what makes Police Story exceptional is that it's hilarious. Jackie Chan was a master of slapstick comedy, and somehow made his deathly stunts look funny. This is a guy who could look death in the face and laugh. It was clear that Jackie Chan was a superstar talent who was due for a worldwide breakout, and Police Story is perhaps the best work of his career. It seems that we really loved our good guy police stories in the 1980s, but now it's time to talk about the bad guy. Number 9, Scarface, 1983. Scarface is like a dark and twisted depiction of the American dream, told through one of the greatest characters in cinematic history, Tony Montana. The opening half of Scarface is one of my favorite rags to riches stories ever. Tony is a despicable guy, but despite that, somehow his self-belief and machismo are just infectious.
Deep down, we all wish we had the balls to be like Tony Montana, man.
But as things move along, we find out why Tony truly is the bad guy. Along with its excellent story, Scarface just has such a cool vibe. 1980s Miami is such a fun setting. A bright tropical paradise on the surface underpinned by the darkest, seediest parts of humanity. Now that we've talked about the bad guy, it's time to get back to the good guys with number 8, RoboCop, 1987. When RoboCop was released, audiences expected it to be a generic, schlocky action movie. And the funny thing is, on that level, it still totally delivered. But as we all know, RoboCop is so much more than that. It's like an action classic, a searing satire of 80s capitalism, and a Greek tragedy all rolled into one. An amazing thing about RoboCop is how it could seamlessly weave between different tones and still work. One moment you're laughing at a yuppie suit getting violently murdered by Ed 209, and the next you feel sick watching Murphy get brutalized in the exact same way. RoboCop just feels so real, largely due to one of the greatest physical performances of all time by Peter Weller. It also spawned the classic playground question: who would win in a fight, RoboCop or number 7, The Terminator, 1984. The Terminator is a masterful blend of 3 genres: the action film, the slasher, and the sci-fi epic. It was an excellent big-budget debut for one of the greatest filmmakers in history, James Cameron. Its man versus machine, cat-and-mouse story is intense. The Terminator is an unstoppable, badass film monster, and the idea of it chasing you is simply terrifying. Then you have one of the most iconic soundtracks in film history, a synth score with heavy percussion that sounds like a futuristic nightmare. Hearing that score with the film's haunting portrayal of the future is simply unforgettable. The idea of Terminators and Skynet has only gotten scarier as the years go by, but nothing is scarier than carrying a chest burster in number 6. Aliens, 1986. Aliens is such a genius sequel title that leaves so much to the imagination. Instead of trying to top its predecessor, a sci-fi horror classic, James Cameron took the series in a more action-oriented direction. This change of tone worked flawlessly because this time we follow a group of cocky space marines who boasted enough firepower to give the aliens a taste of their own medicine. And while the space marines are great, none of them hold a candle to the badass that is Ellen Ripley. Ripley is such a badass because despite being terrified, she always finds the resolve to push forward and protect everyone around her. Aliens is also a special effects spectacle, boasting some of the greatest costumes and set designs of the era. But I think we've been in space for long enough, so let's hit the road with number 5, The Road Warrior, 1981. The movie that created the template for nearly every post-apocalyptic world. The aesthetic that originated from this movie is iconic, from the leather punk look of the bandits to its Frankenstein vehicles or its barren wasteland. But where The Road Warrior shines is undoubtedly in the car stunt. I've heard people say that this movie was made irrelevant by Fury Road, which is something that I completely disagree with. To me, the final chase scene of The Road Warrior has similar merits to the final battle of Seven Samurai. Even though it doesn't match modern technical standards, it makes up for that by feeling more dangerous and real than anything we could make today. It captured a moment in time when filmmakers did whatever crazy thing it took to get a shot, which makes it an immortal 80s classic. And now let's get to the next 80s classic with number 4, Predator, 1987. I see Predator as the 80s action movie formula reaching perfection. Like the Terminator, it mixed the action movie, the slasher, and sci-fi to make something truly original. It turned the slasher formula on its head by having some of the most badass people alive be the victims. And I love the way the Predator slowly unveils itself to the mercenaries and us at the same time. It puts our group of action heroes in an unfamiliar position where instead of being the hunter, they're the hunted. This all culminates in perhaps the best final showdown of the 80s that forces Arnold to use his brains instead of his brawn to stand a chance. While Predator is undoubtedly one of the best action movies of the 80s, it and the entire action genre owe so much to number 3, First Blood, 1982. First Blood is basically the movie that created the 80s action template, the lone badass taking on dozens of men alone, a muscular hero holding a machine gun, the big final showdown. It all evolved from here. Interestingly, much like John Carpenter's Halloween was for the slasher, First Blood is a much more intelligent and deep movie than the genre that it spawned. And funny enough, the Rambo series itself was largely responsible for the cheesy 80s action stereotype, but that wasn't the case here. John Rambo is definitely the ultimate badass, but it's more of a tragedy than a triumph. The same things that caused Rambo to become such a badass left him a broken man. I really respect that First Blood let its hero be vulnerable at the peak of the hyper-masculine era. I feel that 80s cinema truly found itself in 1982, which is thanks in large part to First Blood and number 2, Blade Runner, 1982. Blade Runner is an atmospheric experience that's unlike anything else, but it took people a while to know what to make of it. Since it's a science fiction movie starring Harrison Ford in the early 80s, people expected it to be this fun sci-fi romp and were left disappointed. But Blade Runner isn't a roller coaster ride like Star Wars or Indiana Jones. It's more like a rainy, midnight walk in Tokyo. Ridley Scott's masterfully created sci-fi world is so rich, detailed, and timeless that you can get lost in every frame. It basically defined the look of the cyberpunk genre, which has barely changed 40 years later. And of course, it's also one of the most influential movies ever. Blade Runner is definitely on the Mount Rushmore of 80s cool, but there can only be one king, and that is number 1, Die Hard, 1988. Die Hard is the pinnacle of 80s action. It had the perfect action premise that basically spawned its own subgenre. Die Hard on a boat, Die Hard on a bus, Die Hard on a plane, you name it. You put an underdog hero in an area held hostage by a group of bad guys and you make movie magic. Everything about Die Hard just works. The story is extremely entertaining from start to finish. The pacing is just perfect as the intensity keeps rising until it explodes. And I love how John McClane's physical condition makes you feel the ordeal that he's gone through. You get the perfect blend of action, comedy, and banter between characters. Hans is one of the best villains of the 80s. His sophisticated wit contrasted perfectly with John McClane's street-smart New York attitude. And Bruce Willis, of course, is the ultimate badass. I mean, what can I say, guys? It's freaking Die Hard, and this was the best of 80s cool.
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.